consider the silence surrounding Socrates. It is a profound and persistent silence, one that demands more than mere attention. It asks for contemplation itself. We see him in an Athenian street, amidst the vibrant chaos of life, the hurried steps of merchants, the boisterous laughter of students, the measured gait of citizens passing by. Yet, throughout this vivid tableau of human experience, there is always a subtle quietude around him. It is not the silence of absence, but the weightier silence of presence, the kind that settles deep into your bones and makes you pause, forcing you to look inward. We often conceive of wisdom as something that can be captured on parchment, a neatly organized treatise, a series of definitive arguments bound in leather. We expect knowledge to be catalogued, categorized, and stored away for future generations to consume. This expectation, however, forms the very cornerstone of Socrates' great philosophical paradox. He lived a life so profoundly rich with wisdom spoke volumes that echoed across the marketplace, engaged in dialogues that challenged the deepest assumptions of his time. Yet he left no book. There is no surviving manuscript bearing the weight of his thought or the brilliance of his inquiry. This absence is not merely an historical footnote. It is a central philosophical challenge. Why did the greatest mind of the classical age refuse to write? Was it a matter of practicality, limited by the resources and technology of ancient Greece? Perhaps. But if we look beyond the logistical constraints, if we strip away the concern for mere physicality, we must ask about the nature of true knowledge itself. Is wisdom best contained within the rigid structures of sentences on paper, or does it require a more fluid, living medium? The pursuit of documented thought suggests that knowledge is a commodity to be owned, stored, and transmitted systematically. But Socrates' method resists this commodification. His philosophy was not meant for passive consumption. It demanded active participation. To understand Socrates, you could not simply read him. You had to meet him, question yourself in his presence, and endure the necessary discomfort of your own intellectual unpreparedness. His wisdom was an experience, a crucible designed not to give answers, but to sharpen the questions. I imagine those dialogues, standing there with the self-satisfied Athenian philosopher, full of certainty regarding justice or piety, a man who believes he knows everything because his reputation and his teachings have built him a solid edifice of certainty around himself. Socrates approaches this person not as a combatant, but perhaps as a humble traveler encountering another soul. And what begins is not an argument, but something far more subtle, a systematic process of gentle disorientation. He does not offer doctrine. He offers inquiry. The hallmark of his method, which we now call Socratic irony, is that it requires absolutely no definitive answers from him. Instead, he asks questions designed to expose the beautiful but terrifying chasm between what someone thinks they know and what they actually understand. He gently follows a line of reasoning until the initial edifice of certainty begins to tremble. The person who started boastfully leaves the exchange feeling not merely questioned, but hollowed out, confronted by an unsettling truth that they knew very little indeed. This was a relentless intellectual burden. It required immense courage and profound humility on Socrates' part. It meant accepting the role of the gadfly, the persistent irritant, whose purpose is to wake up a sleeping giant or prompt deep self-reflection in a complacent society. One cannot live this life while simultaneously worrying about bibliography or publishing dates. The moment you begin considering how your ideas will be packaged, they risk losing their immediate, sharp vitality. The thought process slows down, adapts to commercial viability, and inevitably softens its edge of truth. True philosophy, as Socrates practiced it, is an act of disruption. It disrupts false assumptions, disrupted complacency, and most critically, disrupted the self-delusion we build up within our own minds. And such disruptive acts cannot be bound neatly between two covers. They must breathe in the space between people, within the spontaneous rhythm of human interaction. The difficulty of this life is compounded by its philosophical cost. To perpetually observe the folly of others, to guide them toward recognizing their own ignorance, it takes an exhausting mental energy. It demands constant vigilance against accepting superficial consensus, simply because consensus is easier than truth. It is a lifestyle that privileges genuine understanding over intellectual fame. Think of the weight of this realization, that the greatest minds in history often lived for the message itself, not for the legacy attached to the message. Their reward was participation and the transformative experience shared with another thinking being. Socrates' refusal to write becomes, therefore, a profound statement on the nature of wisdom itself. It posits that knowledge is inherently oral, conversational, and perishable in the most beautiful way. It must be continually reapplied, freshly lived out. If you document the moment of realization, you strip away its power. The realization itself happens to you, not just for you to read about. We are left contemplating a model of intellectual life that is antithetical to our modern obsession with permanence and documentation. We crave archives. Socrates preferred the agora. He taught us that the most profound truths reside in the unwritten pauses, the silences after the questions, the moments of shared realization that happen under the Athenian sun, but vanish into the mist of memory, forcing each person involved to internalize them fully. This echoes with a deep resonance through the centuries. True wisdom does not reproduce easily. It is a living performance, requiring constant engagement and self-examination, making the individual life itself the most authentic, necessary text. It was a burden, a profound and ceaseless weight that settled upon the soul of every man who dared to truly think. To observe, year after year, the casual arrogance with which men carried themselves through the sunlit streets of Athens. They were convinced of their certainty. They believed in the solid structures of their knowledge, built brick by careful brick over generations. Yet, when you stood before them, equipped only with questions, those structures began to tremble. It was not a challenge meant to win an argument, but rather a gentle unveiling, a mirror held up to the unsuspecting self. The sheer weight of confronting one's own ignorance is enough to paralyze the spirit. Socrates understood this weight intimately. He recognized that the highest calling of philosophy was not accumulation, but demolition. We often mistake certainty for knowledge, do we not? We treat opinion as if it were verifiable fact, and thus we build monuments to belief, standing proud and unchallenged. But genuine understanding, the kind that starts with a shuddering doubt, sees only shadows cast upon the cave wall. He taught them not what to think, but how much they did not know. And in this profound realization lies an immense difficulty, an internal friction. Imagine the weariness of constantly dismantling the comfortable myths others live by. To peel back layers of ingrained assumption requires effort that is both exhausting and transformative. It is a labor of love, perhaps, or maybe simply a necessary civic duty to guide humanity out of its slumbering complacency. This constant process of questioning meant that any recorded treatise would feel like a betrayal, a premature capture of a fleeting moment of realization. Knowledge gleaned through dialogue is inherently perishable. It needs the warm breath of immediate conversation to remain alive. To write it down, to seal it on parchment, risked transforming living truth into inert dogma. The act of writing implies finality, an end point. But philosophy, true philosophical life, has no end point. It is a continuous turning, a perpetual ascent up the mountain of doubt toward humility. Socrates lived this paradox every day. How does one sustain a relentless pursuit of truth without becoming merely a chronicler of his own journey? The cumulative impact of decades spent exposing collective intellectual vanity must take its toll. The mind becomes a vast echo chamber, hearing only whispers of inadequacy and beautiful potential. He saw the flaws not just in others, but in the very foundations of Athenian society, a belief that political success equated to moral wisdom, that the loudest voice was always the wisest, even when that voice knew nothing at all. This burden is more taxing than physical toil. It is a corrosive intellectual labor. It requires patience beyond measure and a detachment from the praise or criticism of others. For if your sole goal is external recognition, your questions cease to be purifying and become merely provocative squabbles. The true philosopher must pursue knowledge for its own sake, recognizing that wisdom is not a commodity to be traded or permanently documented. Instead, it is an inner discipline, a constant tuning of the soul against the dissonance of unexamined life. And this realization brought him into conflict naturally. Those who desire comfort prefer the smooth, predictable narrative. They do not wish for the jagged edges of self-doubt that wisdom provides. They preferred the solid allusion to the difficult truth. The struggle is therefore one of stamina, the endurance needed to maintain intellectual integrity when it costs you social ease, material comfort, and even your life. To live so fully in dialogue means never having a final word, only perpetual refinement. It suggests a commitment not merely to learning, but to constant becoming. He was, in essence, an unstoppable intellectual force majeure, operating within the intimate confines of human interaction. The true message, therefore, could never be confined to ink and paper. It needed the breath of life, the immediacy of the encounter, the raw electric charge passing between two questioning souls. It had to happen here, at this crossroads, in this moment. For those who were ready to hear it, the weight of knowledge can be a profound burden. It does not merely sit upon the mind, it settles in the soul, demanding an enormous expenditure of constant vigilance and painful self-awareness. We have seen how Socrates questioned everything comfortable, the assumptions of the agora, the established truths held by civic leaders, even the most cherished definitions of justice or virtue. This process of relentless questioning is not a performance. It is survival. It is the very breath of the disciplined mind, confronted with the vast, uncharted territory of human ignorance. Yet, this constant state of intellectual combat takes its toll. The philosopher does not rest, and perhaps that inability to pause is precisely what prevented him from ever translating his wisdom onto parchment. The true act of philosophy, as we have learned, is never a destination. It is the arduous process of drawing attention to where one stands, standing in ignorance, yet aware enough to question it. This requires an unrelenting energy, a ceaseless mental dialogue that leaves little room for the quiet, solitary task of composition. Writing demands coherence, a neat conclusion, a sense of closure. But wisdom itself resists neatness. It is messy and circular, much like the eternal turning of the Athenian seasons or the unending questions posed by youth. To try to bottle the fluid nature of understanding into fixed words is to diminish it, making it palatable, but ultimately false. This brings us to a moment we must contemplate, the pause. The philosopher's life demands momentum. Every conversation is a swing, every idea a challenge. But true mastery lies not just in the speaking, but in the knowing when to be silent. It requires a kind of athletic patience, the virtue that knows the immense difference between merely having an answer and genuinely possessing understanding. Consider the quiet pause near the agora at dusk. The sunlight is softening, casting long shadows that stretch across the paving stones like unanswered questions. Here, the weight shifts from external argument to internal discipline. It becomes a meditation on self-control, a reflection of Stoic principles, applied not just in times of crisis, but in the mundane rhythms of existence. The initial impulse might be to articulate everything, to catalog every insight gleaned from the day's questioning, to record the elegant structure of his latest realization. But this desire must yield to something deeper: restraint. The quiet pause is the deepest form of philosophical acknowledgement. It is recognizing that before speaking or before writing, there must be an emptying out. One must clear the mind of accumulated chatter and settled opinions. This stillness is not empty, it is pregnant with potential. It is the deep reservoir of reflection necessary to achieve clarity. To pause is to actively practice skepticism toward one's own certainty, even when that certainty feels like truth itself. The disciplined life forces Socrates into this rhythm. He learns that wisdom requires not just knowing what to say, but recognizing the profound power inherent in what remains unsaid. The silence becomes a form of language far more potent than any written text. It communicates humility before the complexity of existence, and it signals respect for the other person who may be wrestling with similar doubts. This internalization is difficult. It requires mastering the internal critic, the relentless urge to prove one's brilliance by recording every thought. The mentor must therefore model a different kind of intellectual bravery, the courage to simply be present, fully engaged in the moment without needing validation through permanent documentation. This disciplined silence transforms the philosopher from a mere speaker into an embodiment of contemplation itself. We find that true knowledge is less like a library, a place of stored facts and proven arguments, and more like a stream, a constant flow, always moving, always changing, impossible to capture in one single volume. To live philosophically is to maintain oneself within the riverbed of constant questioning. Any attempt to stabilize it by turning it into a book would kill its essence. The knowledge must be actionable, living proof demonstrated through continued existence. And so, Socrates' refusal to document his thoughts was not an act of intellectual failure or even laziness. It was perhaps the most profound philosophical statement imaginable. It argued that the highest form of understanding cannot be contained by human artifice. It must instead permeate one's very actions, shaping how you interact with others, how you respond when confronted by a flawed premise, and how you manage the quiet solitude of your own mind. His life became the argument itself, a living text, continuously revised by every encounter, every sunrise, and every difficult conversation under the vast Athenian sky. We have reached a point of profound realization. The great paradox surrounding Socrates was not merely that he left no written works. It was that his existence became the ultimate text, the definitive living proof of philosophy itself. For many people in Athens, the ideal form of wisdom belonged on papyrus, a portable, permanent record they could buy, shelf, and consult when doubt crept into their minds. They expected grand treatises, chapter headings, and bulleted points. But Socrates offered them something far more unsettling to those who preferred comfortable certainty: the demanding reality of a life lived under constant scrutiny. His philosophy could not be contained within the neat lines of an argument, because its deepest truths were inherently mutable, requiring real-time engagement with the chaos of human conversation. Think for a moment about what it means to write down wisdom. Writing implies finality. It suggests that once the words are set in ink, they are correct forever. They create a single, perfect snapshot of an idea. But life, true human experience, is never fixed. It shifts with the passing breeze and changes depending on the speaker. If you try to nail down the fluidity of justice or the complexity of virtue onto a scroll, the moment the ink dries, the truth has already slipped away. Socrates understood this limitation of documentation better than anyone. He knew that knowledge captured by writing was often merely an elegant theory, beautiful in its structure, but hollow when faced with the grit and noise of daily life. The greatest intellectual burden, therefore, was not the act of questioning others, though that was exhausting enough. The real burden was maintaining a continuous state of becoming, of perpetually arguing against your own assumption of certainty. His life became a performance art piece of relentless self-correction. He refused to become a published scholar, because scholarship, by its very nature, encourages accumulation and closure. To write is to say, I know this much, here is the boundary. Socrates sought no boundaries. He lived in the space between ideas, in the delicate pause before understanding dawns on another person's face. That interstitial space, that moment of genuine questioning, was far more valuable than any completed manuscript. This required an enormous degree of disciplined presence. It meant rejecting the intellectual comfort of retirement or study. He had to stay out among the noisy crowds of the agora. He had to interact with market vendors debating prices, with politicians boasting of their perceived authority, and with young men arrogant in their untested knowledge. Each interaction was a test, not for them, but for him, a way of keeping his own philosophical muscles limber, refusing to become complacent himself. His day-to-day movement through Athens was, quite literally, the examination. It was a dialogue that unfolded under harsh Athenian sunlight, punctuated by chance encounters and sudden moments of shared realization. Consider the sheer energy required for this sustained performance of inquiry. Every single conversation was an active withdrawal from assumed knowledge. When someone claimed expertise in ethics or rhetoric, Socrates did not merely refute them. He guided them back to their own initial definitions. He would ask, if justice is giving each person what they deserve, then does a tyrant who steals enough goods to make the victim seem undeserving have committed injustice? These questions were designed not to be answered and recorded, but to force reflection. They were tools for momentary enlightenment, gifts intended only for the recipients of the inquiry. The life lived in this manner, the perpetually examined existence, becomes a form of profound resistance against both ignorance and intellectual complacency. It asserts that the practice of philosophy must eclipse the mere theory of it. The knowledge remains unstable, raw, and alive. It cannot be packaged or sold. Furthermore, by refusing to publish, Socrates implicitly taught his students a lesson far more revolutionary than any philosophical maxim. Wisdom is not something you own. It is something you continuously do. It is a muscle that must be exercised daily through the friction of human relationships. His journey was therefore less about achieving an ultimate truth and more about modeling the process by which truth can be sought. He taught them how to doubt what they thought they knew, even doubting the core premises of their own lives. The culmination of his philosophy, in this sense, is found not on a shelf of scrolls waiting for rediscovery, but within the fragile, ever unwritten dialogues taking place between two human beings right now. His life stands as an enduring argument that genuine self-awareness cannot be summarized. It must be negotiated through continuous engagement with the messy, beautiful complexity of being alive. If we have followed the journey of Socrates, we come now to a quiet understanding. We often think that wisdom is something found, or something packaged, a set of theories written down for easy consumption. But what if true knowledge resists such neat packaging? What if the greatest teachings are those that cannot be contained by paper and ink? This realization forces us inward, away from the clamor of the agora, to a place far more private, the space within ourselves. Our final reflection must turn not toward the man himself, but toward the nature of the journey he represented, a continuous conversation with the self. For Socrates did not write books because his philosophy was fundamentally designed to be lived, not merely read. It is an experience